But thank you all so much for being here. My name is Courtney McSwain. I am the communications strategist for the National Juvenile Justice Network. And just want to thank you for spending some of your afternoon with us today. This is our session, the first part of our reporter education series called Covering the Youth Justice Beat. And today's panel discussion is called Beyond the Myths, Using Data and Trends Accurately to Avoid Racial Stereotyping in Youth Justice Media Coverage. This is a part of our Elevation of Youth Justice Action Month. So hopefully everyone here is aware that October is YJAM, Youth Justice Action Month. And we want to thank our partners for joining us in today's conversation, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, the Sentencing Project, and YR Media. So thank you to our partners for helping us co-host today's conversation. And just a little bit about who's in the room so you're aware of who's here today in terms of the audience. We have, of course, our friends in the media, journalists and reporters who are here today, as well as advocates and members of NJJN. I think we have some system stakeholders here. So a really great diverse folks in the room. And today's conversation, our goal is to offer background and context to help journalists produce stronger reporting in local and national stories related to youth in the legal system. And specifically today, we wanted to carve out some time to talk about how stereotypes and the unjust criminalization of youth, particularly youth of color, is perpetuated in press stories via certain uses of language, images, and data. So that's kind of the focus of today's conversation. As we're going through, we're going to do the first part as a Q&A. So I have some questions for our panel, and then we're going to leave some time at the end for questions from the audience. But please feel free to go ahead and type in your questions into the chat if you would like to. If you hear something that you want to comment on, feel free to go ahead and put that into the chat. Feel free to have conversations with each other in the chat. We definitely want to encourage you to use that chat box as much as possible. So I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and as I introduce you all, if you want to just wave or unmute yourself and say hello, feel free to do that. I will just give their names and their affiliations, but please feel free to look them up. And actually, as I'm saying that, I'll go ahead and type their names into the chat as well. Or Allison, I don't know if you have access to everybody's names and titles, but if you do, maybe we can put those in the chat so that folks can see who's talking, and then you can feel free to look them up and check out their bios and their backgrounds. But to move the conversation along, I'm just going to give their names and titles. So first we have Brittany Lamarr, who is the Justice Advisor at the Connecticut Justice Alliance. Hey, Brittany. We have Ruth Rosenthal, who is the Manager of Juvenile Justice Policy at the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you for being here, Ruth. We have Chris Crutchfield, who is the Deputy Director of Community Relations for Ramsey County Community Corrections. Hey, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thrilled to be here.
Thank you. And then we didn't want to have a conversation about the media without the media. So we have Jeremy Loudenbach, who is the Senior Reporter from The Imprint, which is an independent nonprofit daily news publication that covers child welfare, juvenile justice, mental health, and educational issues. So, hey, Jeremy.
Hey, guys. Nice to be here.
Awesome. And thank you, Allison. Allison put in everybody's names and titles into the chat. So thank you so much for that, Allison. And before we get into our Q&A, I do want to turn it over to Josh Rovner, who is the Senior Advocacy Associate with the Sentencing Project, one of our partners today, and pretty much in most of our work that we do. And Josh is going to help us ground today's conversation and give us a sense of why this is a critical conversation to have. So Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And really, I'm thrilled to see so many people here. You know, one of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. He was purported to say that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. When I was preparing for today's discussion, I checked to see that I was remembering the quote correctly. And that's when I discovered Mark Twain never actually said it. The irony to that is just perfect. because it's a lot easier to make up a story than to tell the truth. And that's particularly true when it comes to public safety. Crime waves, worst ever, out of control kids. And there's a couple of reasons why this happens. First, stories are more likely to be believed if they align with what the audience already believes to be true. Gallup, the polling company, asks a question every year: is there more crime in the US than there was a year ago or less? And year after year, about 2/3 of respondents have answered more to that question. Even as data revealed that crime rates and arrest rates were falling, your audience nevertheless believed that crime was increasing. Your audience was wrong. Second, it's easy to change the lens to fit a narrative, particularly when the narrative is that youth, especially youth of color, are out of control. Some of this is old school racism, such as equating Black youth to animals. This refusal to see Black kids are in fact kids was the subject of an excellent and oft-cited study by psychologist Philip Goff and his colleagues. It's the undercurrent of language around super predators, launched by a political scientist named John DiIulio in the 1990s. There's nothing new or clever about any of this. It's racism, but some of it is ancient prejudices against youth in general, imagining that the present generation of teenagers is more irresponsible than any generation before it is the same thing that's always said about teenagers. It was said about all of us when we were teenagers. And correcting these misconceptions is essential. We've seen this movie before. In the 1990s, spurred on by initially deceptive but ultimately false statistics and without any evidence that would make the country any safer, politicians added millions of teenagers, disproportionately youth of color, into adult courts and jails, and then sentenced them to death or life in prison. And that's where bad journalism leads because, well, in my opinion anyway, the public is so eager to hear that other people's children are to blame and that other people are terrible parents. So it fits into an ugly narrative that for a public that always believes that crime is worse than it was at this time last year and is looking for a scapegoat. And what better scapegoat than other people's children? Now, crime rates are not zero, and I imagine they never will be. Our subject today is using data and trends to accurately avoid racial stereotyping. So first data and then trends, because our first challenge is that the relevant data may not even be available at all. Things we would want to know may not be tracked. Things that sound scientific, like recidivism rates, aren't quite really what you're looking for. So you might want to know about crime, but the number that's readily available is arrests. We all face this problem, but some people don't seem particularly bothered by it, comfortably connecting dots whether or not there are any dots to connect. The second challenge is that the data are often stale by the time that they're readily available. The FBI released statistics for calendar year 2020 at the end of September. The 1-year count of juvenile incarceration for 2019, that was released in May. So when someone tells you or you're tempted to write that there's a crime spike underway, ask what that impression is based on. Ask for data and ask for lots of it, which brings me to the second part of our title, trends. A 1-year increase is not trends, period. It's especially important right now because I think we'd all agree that 2019 and 2020 were not typical years, and any changes since then may not tell you all that much. Context matters here. It's so easy to cherry pick data, looking at one offense from one city versus a year ago, instead of comparing and seeing how that number compares to other offenses in that same city, how it compares to other cities and states, broadening the view to a larger time frame to see what's happened recently or in other jurisdictions. Another deceptive tactic is adjusting the parameters of youthfulness to include or exclude older youth to count them as adolescents when it's convenient to the story. You know, it's so frustrating to many of us here when we see anecdotes masquerading as data. And that's why we're thankful that you've actually attended this webinar to discuss this. We hope that today is going to be part of an ongoing and honest conversation about public safety. And now you know where to find us to keep the conversation going. I'll send it back to Courtney to ask questions to the rest of our panel and to take your questions as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, for setting that foundation. And I want to go ahead and just get into the conversation and pick up where Josh sort of grounded us with this question of narrative and the narrative that, you know, these individual instances of youth alleged crime kind of leads to the story that youth crime is increasing and out of control. So I want to go to you, Ruth, and just sort of ask you, you know, with your work at Pew, can you walk us through the context of that question and of that narrative around youth crime increasing? How should we be looking at that? How should we be sort of looking at the sort of the individual stories of youth in the legal system and how that's being reported? And how can we match that with the data and trends as Josh was talking about?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today, Courtney, and thank you all for being here. I mean, I think that Josh really started out this conversation by laying the foundation for what needs to happen, and that's contextualizing what's happening in the system, right? Contextualizing what's happening with this one individual child, contextualizing an alleged crime spike over time. Because if you look at the data over the last several decades, what you'll see is not only a tremendous downturn in juvenile crime, but that includes a downturn in violent crime. And Americans are generally safer than they have been for decades. So I think where Josh started is the place where we all should be starting. But I think the next place that we should go, you know, oftentimes when we see these stories reported or when you talk to stakeholders about these individual instances of crime or purported crime spikes or real crime spikes, because real crime spikes do happen, it's reported in tandem with something that looks like a reform that was soft on crime or a reduction in some kind of practice that's related to incarceration. And so I think what's really important in the context of this type of reporting is also grounding your story in what works, right? And we know a lot about what works. We know also a lot about what doesn't work to support reduced victimization, to support the positive development of young people in our communities. And what doesn't work is exactly what often gets tied to these spikes in crimes in reporting or in reporting by different stakeholders related to the system, and that's incarceration. We know from a wide array of research that there isn't support for incarceration as it relates to the reduction in crime and a reduction in victimization in our community for nearly all youth, and that includes young people who are committing serious violent crimes. In fact, there is new and growing bodies of research that support the notion that for most young people, including kids who are committing moderate severity offenses like first-time burglaries, a response to their behavior outside of the system, or what we talk about often as diversion, is related with an increased likelihood of future success and a lower rate of recidivism. And so I think when reporting is happening related to these sort of individual stories of serious crime or these individual crime spikes, in addition to talking about the general trends and the notion that we are all safer than we have been for decades, one of the other things that we should be talking about is what actually works to reduce crime. You know, we see around the country reductions in incarceration associated simultaneously with reductions in crime. And we know from the research that reductions in incarceration should lead to reduced victimization long term. And then I think the other question that we should be asking is, what are the practices and policies in place in our systems that are either supporting reduced victimization and these downward trends that we see in arrest, or that are potentially hampering reductions in victimization, right? So are states and localities who are seeing these spikes in crimes or who are reporting on individual cases actually putting in place practices and policies that are consistent with what the research says works to reduce crime? Are they diverting young people? Are they taking out kids from facilities and placements that we know don't work? Are we keeping them in their homes with the supports and services that they need to grow up and be productive, supported members of our community? Or are they perpetuating practices that we know don't work? And you know, when you're talking to stakeholders about what's happening, what are their motivations for perpetuating practices that might not work, right? If you're talking to to a probation officer? What are their motivations for trying to keep kids from being diverted, from saying that putting kids on probation, keeping them in the system is important? There are a lot of jobs that are associated with some of these practices and the way that we have historically run our system that we now know doesn't work. So I'll give you an example, and Courtney, feel free to cut me off if I'm running out of time, but Pennsylvania has recently undertaken a study of their system to try to understand what kind of practices, what kind of outcomes their practices are having and how they're aligned with research or how they're not aligned with research. And, you know, there was a prevailing conversation, a prevailing notion in Pennsylvania before they started this work that the system had got it right, that they'd somehow whittled down the kids who were in placement to the ones who were the most serious, the most aggressive, the most problematic. And, you know, Josh touched on this problematic coded language that often comes up in the juvenile context that's often associated with race. I know Brittany is going to probably talk a little bit about that later, so I will leave it there. But when you peel back the data, Pennsylvania did have good trends. Incarceration was going down, crime was going down. But when you take a look at what was happening, they hadn't actually done anything proactively over the last 10 years to change who was in their custody. Rates are down, but you still see more or less the same profile of kids who are coming into the system, who are coming into their facilities, right? And those kids are not, they're not kids who you would think of who have committed serious violent crimes. Although, again, we know the research doesn't even support incarceration for most of them as a way to reduce victimization in the community. Most of the kids in their custody are there on first-time offenses. They're there for misdemeanors. They're there for non-persons offenses. And they're staying in the system, moving through multiple placement for years at a time. And so I think that there's a question to be asked, in addition to this question about trends, in addition to questions about what works, about what the system is actually doing to perpetuate the positive trends you're seeing, or to do the opposite, right? And, you know, it's not just Pennsylvania that we've seen this in state after state where we've worked, we've seen the same kind of thing. You see positive downward trends, but when you peel back the onion a little bit, what you see is a lot of practices that continue to be problematic. And so I guess I will leave it at there, and I can answer questions later, but my sort of three takeaways are, contextualize, as Josh was talking about, really spend a lot of time thinking about what works and what doesn't work, and ask, you know, what are the systems that are in place doing to perpetuate the problems that we know are associated with the increased victimization in our communities. And when you're talking to people, what are their motivations potentially for perpetuating a system that is inconsistent with what we know works to create safer communities and healthier children.
Thank you so much. So that was some really great points to pick up on, and I want to go to Brittany next, because Ruth talked a lot about sort of grounding our story in what works, and in the work that you do with the Connecticut Justice Alliance, which is one of our members, one of our NJJ members. You all are really grounded in trying to get to what works. You're advocating for policy transformation to sort of get to what actually does work, in helping young people who find themselves sort of, you know, involved in the legal system. And so I want to ask you, how does this broader narrative around kind of youth crime and youth crime on the rise, how do you see that playing out with how policy gets enacted, the conversation amongst policymakers and decision makers, and, you know, what's sort of the on the ground impact of this narrative as you see it from the work that you do?
Right, great. Thank you for having me. So first go off of, well, I guess set the stage. So what we do as an alliance, we go into spaces, we have vision sessions, whether it be with police departments, detention centers, any space that we can get into to speak to people directly impacted by the system. We go and we listen and we collect data, and we listen to the voices of people who are directly affected by policies that are in place. With that being said, the narrative that youth crime is on the rise, it's a dangerous false narrative where a select few incidences of crime are used to perpetuate fear and instill the need for policies that are tough on crime. It creates a narrative about all youth who look like the kids that they're talking about, and leaves space for many other indirect harms, like failing to invest into solutions that work, rehabilitative services to address root issues in our youth, and supportive services. And when we do this, we're talking about a lack of recognition of the population that we're dealing with, kids of color that have historically had a lack of services and support. And additionally, currently in Connecticut right now, we're experiencing this with the this narrative that there's been this rise on car theft, which is a false narrative, but it's a narrative that's being driven because the crime has shifted. It's come from cities and now it's into the suburbs. And so now different communities are being affected by problems that have existed for a while now. And now that it's directly affecting other people, now there's these new policies that are meant to be tough on crime. It's creating this narrative that this is something new, that there's this rise, there's this uptick, but really, if there was any movement, it's just a shift in location. Additionally, and then when policymakers hear this narrative, and when this narrative is established actually by policymakers, it creates a sense of urgency in communities to take action as fast and easy as possible. And it's an easy way to convince people that they just need to arrest and incarcerate through fear mongering. When talking about a narrative, it's important to talk about the data and the facts that follow, because there's many unintended consequences from incarcerating our youth. Our youth are not inherently bad. So how can we address them as individuals? How can we invest rather than incarcerate? And that all comes from shifting the narrative.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just as an FYI, if you see me drop off, technology works, but it doesn't work all the time. So I'm on my phone as well. So my voice will be here if my face goes away. But Chris, I want to bring you into this because we're talking about this narrative of sort of youth crime on the rise and the impact of that. And Brittany kind of highlighted how that impacts kind of the advocacy world of trying to influence and advocate for policy that we've shown, as we've highlighted, that actually does work. From where you sit, you kind of you see what the impact is sort of in practice. How do you see this? First of all, can you kind of give us a sense of how you interact with the journalism community and how you help navigate reporters navigate information gathering as they're reporting? And then, is there this expectation, as you see it, to be quote unquote tougher on young people when we have this youth crime on the rise narrative as the dominant story?
So I want to start out by saying how much I'm enjoying this conversation and hearing just such great insights from the other panelists. It's wonderful to hear their thoughts. It's wonderful to share their thoughts. There has been in Minnesota, in Ramsey County. I'm actually in Milwaukee right now for a college visit, but where I work in Ramsey County, which is the capital city county in Minnesota, there has always been a narrative that, oh, you lock the kids up and they're out on the street 15 minutes later and you're too soft. Ever since I've worked in Minnesota since 2005. And I want to start out by saying that there's kind of a quiet narrative there, and that's that these are not the children that are the children of the people that are reading the paper or watching the news. These are other people's kids. These are the Black kids, not my kids. And I think that really plays a real role in this, because when we talk about youth misbehavior, all youth misbehave. It's kind of part of being a young person. But there's really my kids, and they're just, and then there are those other kids. And I think that is something that we have to continue to address. And like I said, since 2005, we've been working in Ramsey County on justice reform, and there have always been people ready. It's like they have their arguments ready, and if there's a high-profile juvenile crime, they jump out and say, "See, justice reform didn't work. Look at what happened." And we have to say, no, we have to look at the data, and this is an outlier, blah blah blah. And we've had to keep pushing that narrative back. And with COVID, here it comes again. And I think that the role from my role, and I think the role in corrections and in the jurisdictions that have been working on justice reform, is to fall back on your data. Really, you really want to let your data drive the process and drive the issue. And so what I try and do is try and provide as much, not anecdotal, because there's always the anecdotal that will support, but the data of what's really happening with our kids, with our children in our community. And so trying to provide accurate data, and that can actually get really tricky because the police, they collect data, and corrections collects data, and everyone's collecting, the prosecutors, and just all the sometimes the data you can get the devil's in the details. For example, address, right? Is it the youth address, right? Is it the address where the crime was committed? Is it the address of the victim? That's just a funky little example of, you want to have good, solid data, and you really want to think about those things and put that data out. The other thing is, you want to make sure, because our staff are really the subject matter experts. They really work with the kids. And so you want to really make sure that the media understand that our correction staff, our probation officers, our correctional officers, who really care deeply about these kids, they're as much of a subject matter expert. They know just as much as law enforcement, just as much as the prosecutor, and they are doing this every day. And you really want to stay laser focused on what are the best outcomes for these youth, and what are the best outcomes for our community. And like Ruth said, what works, because many times those things coincide. And what doesn't work is locking up these kids. And to show that with data, and to show and to tell other anecdotal stories about how our system is working.
Thank you. And so I want to just let everyone know, when we send out the video of today's recording, we're also going to send you kind of just a really quick tip sheet to kind of give you our sort of 5 tips to help you in your reporting on these issues as kind of a takeaway from today. So if you're not able to take notes, we got you covered. But one of those tips in that tip sheet is to expand your source database. So I want to make sure that everyone knows what Chris's role is and how you can find someone like him where you are. So Chris, can you explain sort of what's your role, and then how can someone find someone similar to you if they're reporting locally?
Sure. I am Deputy Director for Ramsey County Community Corrections, and our county does both juvenile probation. We also run the Juvenile Detention Center. And so while I'm a deputy and help with policy, I also am in charge of communications. And so looking at what our narrative is, what our message is, and we've been part of JDAI. And so we've been bringing in the prosecutors and lawmakers and the defense and all the different justice players. And that's really helped us because we can provide a counter narrative to this again. And it's just like a broken record. Oh, these kids are getting out as soon as you lock them up. You need to hold them more accountable. All these things that we've heard over and over again. And so really helping to coordinate the message. And when I say message, it's really the honest what's going on and what's happening according to all of us that are justice partners that are working in the best interest of young people. And I'm happy to talk to anyone, email me, text me, call me. But really you're looking for a person who works in communications in a corrections or law enforcement system.
Okay, awesome. And then Amanda just asked, what organizations/agencies tend to collect the best data on incarcerated kids, also the most timely data? So does anyone have insight on that question for Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, so the Sentencing Project is pretty good at compiling this. We rely on data that's collected by the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention on a national level. If you're a local reporter, you'll find that state departments of juvenile justice, which come with different names, in Maryland, I think it's the Department of Juvenile Services. And you can find those data sources, but I think that you can turn to organizations like mine to point you to those data. And I really my reputation relies on doing this accurately. We are an organization that is opposed to mass incarceration and is fighting against it, but my reputation as a source relies on not cherry picking data and getting those numbers correct.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to bring in Jeremy here. We talked a lot about sort of the narrative and kind of how do we work our way down and sort of how that gets played out on the ground. And, Jeremy, you've been covering youth justice issues for many, many years. What are the trends that you've seen in covering these issues? And just to give folks a sense of, how you approach bringing in context and nuance to a story so that it doesn't rely on harmful language or narrative.
Thanks, Courtney. It's great to be here. I guess to start, to answer your question, I kind of want to echo what some of my other panelists have said, just in terms of using data and statistics to ground individual, singular outlier events. And, I would emphasize that, yes, these things happen, but there's also, as a reporter, there's also a wealth of stories. And I hope you wouldn't just be only reporting on these issues, but be looking into the young people, their families, and some of the people who are hopefully working with them, and working to improve the systems and in the communities as well. That being said, data has always been an important guidepost for me in terms of writing stories and trying to center these individual episodes and trends. For example, in looking at data, as I think Ruth also mentioned, many parts of the country, the crime rate is just taking a nosedive. And even, for example, in California, where I'm based out in Los Angeles, even with an uptick in homicides, California has the lowest crime rate ever recorded, I think. And, the same trend is kind of holding out for youth justice. Far fewer young people are being arrested and spending time in detention facilities, which in many parts of the country are half empty. But looking at this data, that even within that, there's nuance within that trend. Despite fewer young people coming into the system, racial disparities are in some cases increasing. So I think all these things, you have an obligation to kind of attach this to if you're looking, picking out, deciding to report on some of these incidents. But yeah, I think there's definitely absolutely sometimes a tendency to overrepresent some crimes episodes. But I also think kind of in addition to kind of owing it to your audience to kind of put this in context, I think kind of scrutinizing what different parties in the process are telling you about some of these events and so-called trends. You should be very skeptical about things said to you by law enforcement officials, whether that's the district attorney, police, certain probation officials. So, being skeptical. And then also, it's really important to seek out other opinions from community-based organizations. Increasingly as this country and local communities are having these conversations about what public safety looks like, I think it's a great opportunity to develop people that can speak to that and kind of explore what that might mean in certain cases or, certain situations, because increasingly there is a diversity of opinions about what that means. So I think it's important find those people that can understand trends and can also give you some context, because the youth justice system is not always in analog to the adult system. So finding people that can put things in context and understand when it's not, this isn't always going to be, the exact same as the adult justice system.
Yeah. So Jeremy, I want to throw you a curveball here, if you don't mind. So Brittany talked about, and I'm just curious how you would approach this. Brittany talked about sort of in Connecticut, this is a storyline or the conversation around the rise in car theft. And I think that that's something that's like a story that we kind of hear repeated. And I'm curious to know, how would you take that as something that maybe is happening locally? And, how would you try to put that in context? Would you try to contextualize that with sort of the national picture? What would you try to do to make sure that people get a full picture of what that looks like?
Sorry, so say again, in Connecticut, there's a rise in.
Yeah, so that like a rise in car theft with young people kind of being
car
involved
thefts, right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there was kind of a spate of coverage in, out of Chicago, maybe last year, about sort of carjackings. And yeah, I would heavily, scrutinize who is telling you that this is a wave or an epidemic. And, also, I mean, we are living in some pretty exceptional times. I mean, we're right in the middle of the pandemic, still in midst of this health crisis. So, I would kind of try to look at that. I would, absolutely seek out organizations that work with young people and, find out. And, also keeping in mind that, these young people have been arrested, but they may not have, had their day in court yet, or just, kind of making sure that you're entering it at the right process. But, again, I would talk to some organizations that work with young people, try to get a perspective on this. If in fact there is, people are seen in that, I would look at it through a couple different lenses, not just, the police, who says, oh, okay, we booked another one, and trying to solicit different perspectives.
Thank you for that. Thank you for running with me. I know I didn't prep you for that question, but it just came to me, and I thought it would be helpful to kind of get a sense of like what's a real world, reporter, the process that you have to go through, and some thoughts on how you would do that.
Also, I mean, another thing which I didn't mention, in addition, every time in, when you're talking about the law, if you're talking to the district attorney's office, you probably might want to seek out the public defender, because as I'm sure, many of you on this panel and those of you listening at home or at work know, I mean, how a case is, depicted, in the media, there may be a lot more there. And public defenders, although oftentimes they may be, it kind of depends on the office and the lawyer, but they may be very, careful about what they say, but they may add a lot of context that may explain or put this, give you really important information that you're not going to glean if you just read the booking report, for example.
Yeah. And Chris, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I just wanted to respond to Amanda's question in the chat. She wanted to know whether we should keep numbers of incarcerated persons broken down by age and race. I just wanted to say absolutely that we do that. Age, race, gender. It's almost like when you go to the doctor, you need to know what's going on. If you're having a problem, the doctor can't just say, well, I think it might be appendicitis. You need to have an accurate picture of what your population is, who's being arrested or who's coming into your system. And so as much data as possible is great. The only thing we don't do is we make sure that the data cannot be disaggregated to the point where we can identify an individual child, but aggregated, as long as it's disaggregated, we really want to have a real accurate picture of who's in our correction system, who's coming in, who's going out. Are they coming in for felonies? Are they coming in for violations? Are they appearing in court? The more data, the better is kind of how we view things.
Yeah. And Ruth, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree fully with what Chris said. I think the reality of that is that it varies pretty dramatically from state to state and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I mean, there are states that I've worked at where we go into the agency and we say, how many kids do you have in your custody today, right? And these are people who are the legal parents of these children because their legal custody has been transferred to them, and they say, I don't know. How many kids do you know the whereabouts of today? I don't know. And, you know, if that were a parent in the community who had lost track of their children, they would surely be hauled into court by CPS or incarcerated because they had lost track of their children. Yet agencies around the country oftentimes don't have a clear perspective on how many kids they're supposed to be supervising and parenting, for that matter. I think the other thing to sort of take into consideration is that there are often sort of like different levels of congregate care and incarceration in a state. And so sometimes the Department of Corrections or the Department of Juvenile Justice will have data on kids who are in state custody, but local judges also put kids in custody and they don't have access to that data. And there's also sort of a separate cohort of kids that are in adult corrections. And oftentimes those numbers, and we know those numbers are disproportionately young people of color, and particularly Black boys, don't get included in sort of the count of young people who are placed out of their homes. So leave it there.
Thank you for reminding us of that. And I think that that's a good, if any reporters are looking for stories, that might be a good place to start, sort of what's the discrepancy between that disaggregation across the states. I wanted to go to, and we're coming to our Q&A, to our question from the audience. So if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. But I wanted to come back to Brittany and kind of pick up on this question about language and how language gets used in the media, and words that are coded to refer to young people, particularly youth of color, that perpetuate harmful stereotypes, like the one that we've been trying to get rid of for so long, this kind of super predator idea, and the impact that that has on young people. From where you sit and the work that you do, can you tell us a little bit about how that language actually plays out when you are, advocating, and how that affects young people in their lives?
Right. Certainly. So, and Josh kind of touched on this in the beginning of where the super predator terminology had manifested, so back in the 90s, and then how it spread so quickly through the media. And so the fear-mongering implications of super predator are, that word may not be used as frequently as it was in the 90s, but those implications and the fear-mongering implications of that word are now cultivated through the media with dehumanizing and insensitive words like juvenile, thug, and delinquent. So our society makes a distinction between crimes committed by children and adults because we have an understanding that developmentally they have different concepts of guilt and responsibility. So when we use terms like juvenile to describe youth of color, we blur this distinction for readers and listeners. We turn children into criminals instead of what they are, which is children. So the media will use terms like juvenile male instead of boy or teenager, which further dehumanizes the individual that we're talking about and eliminates that ability to empathize or connect with the young person that we're speaking about. When you think of the word juvenile, additionally, you think of the other words associated with it, delinquent, criminal, bad, words that criminalize the person that you are, the person being identified, right? And this exasperates that fear-mongering of youth of color that's already been like so established in our society, historically established in our society. And this further disenfranchises an already marginalized population. It cements barriers in access to equal opportunity and resources for our youth who lack it most. A further labeling, it doesn't just insist on the narrative that already exists and perpetuate fear-mongering. Labels have an impact on our developing youth. So young people who are already in the process of self-identifying and self-understanding internalize labels. They destroy self-esteem, they stunt growth, and they become a mental cage for our youth. So we need to call our young people by what they are, which is young people. They're our future. Labels, additionally, they create, like I said earlier, they create that disconnect rather than empathy than the people that we're talking about. And they dehumanize.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. And again, we're going to be sending out a tip sheet tomorrow when we send out the recording, but one of the links on there is to the Marshall Project, and we may have someone on from the Marshall Project. I think they registered. So if you're there, hello. But they have a really great kind of collection of information around this conversation of language and you know, their style guide. So I would encourage folks to check that out as well. If you do have some questions for our panel, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. We've got about 10 more minutes, so we'd love to get your questions in if you have any other questions. While we wait for folks to put questions in the chat, I have another one for folks. If you had a piece of advice or information that you could share with reporters on covering youth justice, youth legal issues, what would that be? And anyone who wants to jump in there can take that.
I'm going to give a really short answer to that question because Brittany in Connecticut is going to, you know, she keeps bringing up car thefts. And anyone who's writing about car thefts, I would like the first question that you ask the police officer is, were the keys in the car and was the car running? Because I see that in every article about car theft, somewhere around paragraph 15, that 90% of the time that a car is stolen, that the keys were left in the car and the car was running. I think that is a relevant fact to get out there. I would want that in any of those articles.
Awesome. Anybody else want to jump in?
You know, Jeremy talked a little bit about this, about how important the data is, but also how it's important not to lose sight of how impactful individual narrative can be. And I think we've seen that this past year with the story of Grace out of Michigan, and unfortunately with the horrendous killing of Cornelius Frederick. And those stories were reported as sort of sensational stories that are, maybe this is how it came across to me, but that were sort of atypical, right? Horror stories, and they are horrific, but they are not atypical. They're not atypical during the pandemic, and they're not atypical when there is no pandemic. They're not atypical during spikes in crime or declines in crime. And so I think it's just important to recognize, to highlight those stories and how awful they are, because we've seen how much those can move policymakers to re-examine their practices and their systems, but also to recognize how these are really germane practices to our juvenile justice systems around the country, and to elevate that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you for highlighting that. So we have a question from Sam, and Sam asks, what's the most common mistake or misnomer y'all see in news stories about youth? Yeah, go ahead, Josh. You want to jump in?
I think it's this idea that this generation is worse than any generation that came before it. And we have all sorts of data sets that prove that's not true. You know, I mean, Jeremy was talking about crime rates in California or incarceration rates that we can see in a number of states. But, you know, check out the rate of smoking or alcohol use, or the percent of kids who are holding off their first sexual encounters, or how often they wear seatbelts. This is a deeply responsible generation, and you would never know that by looking at the reporting. You know, I graduated high school in 1993, which, you know, fits very neatly with the generation that was called super predators. Now, that wasn't talking about people who look like me or people who look like my kids, but it's very clear from any objective standard that kids today are doing much better than they were, despite the fact that we haven't done things like tackling poverty, despite the fact that hunger persists. But any number of other measurable things. And you can see this in the CDC's data, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey of how often they smoke, how often they drink. This is a good generation of kids. And as with the rest of us, while they are teenagers, they're making mistakes. I certainly did. I expect my kids will make those mistakes. But the idea that this generation is so reckless, I mean, the music that they're listening to, the video games they're playing, they said the same thing when I was in high school too. And it's laughable when you think about your own teenage years and the stupid things that all of us did as teenagers. That's, I'd say, my biggest, my answer to that question, Sam, fits into that of like, what is teenager? What is adolescence other than making those mistakes?
This is like the best behaved generation of all time. Yeah, it's also interesting to see, not just, over the course of years, but over generations, how often these things get, these tropes get recycled. Like, for example, you mentioned video games, which is always a big one. Back in the 1950s, it was comic books, kind of some of these things don't seem to change over time.
I would also just like to piggyback off of that and say there's not enough news stories about, like Josh had said, Jeremy had said, about the many positive things that our youth participate in. I feel like it's very quick for a news outlet or a news source to jump on a clickbait headline, or for a crime that happened, one particular incident, and create a major headline or news story about this, and picking and choosing which issues and which things we talk about when we talk about our youth helps establish that narrative. So if we were to incorporate a variety of different stories about our youth rather than the stories about youth crime, we can create a whole picture about the youth that we're talking about.
And I also think that I just so appreciate what you all have said, Brittany and Josh and Ruth, and everybody. I think that we live in a real fear-based society right now. I think there's just a lot of fear out there. People are afraid of a lot of different things, and this plays into that narrative. In addition, we're getting hyper-local information. I don't know if anybody has a Ring, but I'm always getting, notifications. There are kids walking down the street. Oh my God, they might be stealing something. And it plays into this narrative of fear that continues and gets perpetuated. And we also have segregated ourselves quite a bit. We continue to segregate ourselves so that we think it's those other kids that are causing these problems, that are creating these crimes, and that are really built in our minds and not in reality.
Yeah, those were all really great points. We have a question from Luis. This may be outside of the scope of our conversation, but I'll present it. Someone may have some thoughts. Luis, or Louis, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I would like to know how to get juvenile probation officials to connect youth to community-based services that are culturally and linguistically relevant. Oftentimes, youth are referred to juvenile probation in house-run programs. This usually keeps youth connected and dependent to probation officials.
So in Ramsey County, we are working really hard to work with our community-based agencies and to outsource that. And that's hard for probation officers because they like to control things. They like to make sure that they have their hand on the stick. And we have to say no. Working with these community-based agencies is actually very effective and more effective than a lot of the in-house stuff. Louis, please contact me. I'm happy to talk to you about some of the things we're doing there, some barriers as far as capacity for some of our new and some of our agencies that are upstart, that work great with our kids, but that they don't always have the capacity of some of the bigger organizations. But also it's a hurdle that our directors and managers and POs have to get over, seeing the community really as the big solution instead of as part of the problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So if there's one more question, we could probably get it in, but I will go ahead and say thank you so much to the panel for joining us today. If you have any final thoughts that anybody wants to get out, we have a few minutes. Let's see. Oh, Fernando just got a question in. Let's see. At times, the difficulties are not on probation side as much as it is community organizations willing to work with these young people who they deem too risky to work with. So I think that was a comment, not a question. Thank you, Fernando. But I'll give maybe if you have like 30 seconds of a last thought people want to give, and then we'll close out. Ruth, any final closing thoughts you want to share?
I just want to thank everyone for this conversation. And, you know, I think just reiterate the points that we've all made, that that these stories need to be contextualized. There's always an opportunity to contextualize them and to question everything, right? Look at the downward trends, but then question what's actually happening on the ground. When you talk to stakeholders, question what their motivations are for giving you the story. Don't just rely on the prosecutor or the probation officer or the politician who tells you that these spikes in crime are related to a reform that's reduced incarceration. Get the data, ask them how they know that, and go back to the information that we have about what works. So thank you all so much for your time, and I will pass the mic to the next person.
Awesome. Josh, any closing thoughts in about 30 seconds?
Wow, Ruth, really, you stole anything I was going to say. I think that journalists, skepticism comes naturally to you, and cynicism correctly comes quickly to you. Understanding that you're dealing with elected officials who have incentives to not tell the truth because their voters don't want to hear the truth. That comes naturally to you when senators say it. Understand that district attorneys, often sheriffs, these are people who also get elected, and that they have agendas of their own also. And I think that just skepticism is warranted. That's all that I ask for.
Muted, Courtney, if you're trying to say something.
Sorry about that. Jeremy, any last thoughts?
Sure. Well, I would agree with everything that Ruth and Josh said, but also, a little bit of a different, view. Also remembering that these young people are also have a story, and as they say, they're more than just the event that may or may not merit a mention in the media, and that like everyone else, they often have there's interesting stories to tell. There's really important backstory and context to that, in addition to the data of that young person and their life. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. These are people, and hopefully you're catching them in a trajectory where they're low, but a lot of cases they will go on to do remarkable things.
Yeah, I love that. Chris, any final thoughts from you?
No, I just love listening to Jeremy and Brittany and Josh and Ruth. I could listen to them all day. I would love an opportunity to hear them again. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And Brittany, I'll let you close us out. Any final thoughts from you?
No, again, it's been a pleasure to be here. I've learned a lot, to even the panelists around me. So it's been a great resource as like my own set of knowledge. I just think it's, language is important. The words we use, aside from the narrative, the words we use in our stories, and the effects that they have on the people we're telling the stories about and on society at large. And that those narratives also help craft policy. So the story that a reporter may be creating can have the effects of whether we invest in incarceration or invest in the resources that a community needs. They do have the ability to craft the perceptions on policies and the support for policies.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for being here, to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone in the audience. And I want to give a shout out to Allison Clement, NJJN's Director of Advocacy and Membership, for helping me out on the back end. Thank you so much. And we will be in touch with this video and part 2 of this series. So stay tuned for that.
Hey,
Thanks,
Courtney,
everybody.
thank you. You did a great job.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
Talk
Courtney.
soon.